Something extraordinary is being whispered about the future of the British monarchy. On Thursday evening, August 13th, 2026, King Charles reportedly entered a private room at Windsor expecting an ordinary discussion about future arrangements. Instead, he allegedly found William and Catherine waiting for him. Between them sat a plain cream-colored folder. There was no royal crest, no dramatic title, just 4 words: the next reign household. Charles opened it, and what he read reportedly forced him to confront something far more personal than palace administration. The document laid out a simple principle: when one reign ends, the working royal household connected to that reign ends with it. That could have enormous consequences for Queen Camilla, because if Charles dies before her, she could remain a respected member of the royal family, continue charitable work, and appear at public events. But she would not automatically inherit the staff, offices, communications operation, or institutional machinery surrounding the king. In other words, she could remain family, but the institution would belong to the new sovereign. And that was only the beginning, because hidden beneath the first page was another sheet, a sheet that reportedly changed the entire meaning of the document. And we will get to that. But first, let's go back to where the story supposedly began. According to the account, Catherine had been reviewing how previous royal transitions worked. At first, everything looked routine. Staff changed. Diaries were reorganized. Patronages were reviewed. Offices moved from one reign to another. Then she reached the events surrounding 1952. King George VI died, and his daughter became Queen Elizabeth II. His widow became known as the Queen Mother. She moved into Clarence House and remained there for decades. She had her own staff, her own diary, her own public role, her own royal household. For years, this became one of the clearest examples of how a former royal consort could remain an important figure long after the monarch had died. But Catherine reportedly noticed something important. The Queen Mother was not simply another former royal wife. She was the new Queen's mother. That relationship mattered. It created a natural reason for her continued position. But Camilla's situation is completely different. She is William's stepmother, and Catherine herself would be queen. That raised an uncomfortable question. Should Camilla automatically receive the same kind of independent household after Charles? Catherine reportedly asked palace officials. The answer was not simple. A surviving royal consort could continue working. She could keep charitable causes. She could remain respected. But creating a separate household would mean much more than giving someone an office. It would mean advisors, private secretaries, communication staff, a separate diary, a separate base of operations, and potentially another center of influence beside the new king. That was the issue Catherine reportedly understood. One royal household could become 2, and 2 centers of authority can create confusion. So the conversation moved away from Camilla. It became about the monarchy itself. What happens when one reign ends? Does everything connected to the previous monarch simply continue? Or should the new sovereign begin with a completely fresh structure? William initially hesitated, not necessarily because he disagreed, but because he knew exactly how the public could interpret it. People would call it revenge. Diana's name would immediately return to the headlines. Others would accuse William of trying to push Camilla aside. And Catherine could be accused of wanting the throne to herself. William reportedly did not want that story. He had spent decades trying to keep old family wounds from becoming public battles. But then Catherine made a suggestion that reportedly changed everything. She told him the rule should apply to her too. Think about what that means. If William became king and Catherine later survived him, she would not expect a separate royal court either. If George became king after William, Catherine would not demand her own institutional machine beside her son's throne. She could remain his mother. She could continue charitable work. She could remain respected. But the royal machinery would belong to George. That made the proposal much harder to attack. It was no longer a rule designed against Camilla. Catherine had placed herself under the same rule. And that is where the story becomes much bigger. Because the proposed principle was reportedly simple. One sovereign, one working household, one center of royal authority. Personal dignity would remain. Family relationships would remain. Charitable work could continue. But institutional power would not automatically pass from one reign into the next. That distinction is crucial. A royal household is not simply a building. It is a network of people who make the royal machine function. Private secretaries, advisors, press officers, diary managers, administrative staff. All of these people answer to someone. If a former consort keeps that structure automatically after the monarch dies, the old reign effectively continues beside the new one. William and Catherine reportedly wanted to stop that from happening. But there was still one huge question. What about Clarence House? For Charles, that building was more than an address. It carried decades of history. The Queen Mother lived there. Charles later used it as his working headquarters before becoming king. And because Buckingham Palace has been undergoing major renovation work, Clarence House has remained closely connected with Charles and Camilla's daily life. So, what happens to it after Charles? Does it automatically remain Camilla's royal base? Or does the next king decide? According to the reported proposal, nothing would be automatic. The next sovereign would decide. And that meant Charles was about to hear something deeply uncomfortable. His son was not simply discussing Camilla. William was discussing what would happen after Charles was gone. When Charles reportedly entered the room, he expected an administrative conversation. Instead, he found the folder waiting. Catherine reportedly opened it. Charles read the first page silently. There was no attack on Camilla. No mention of Diana. No demand that Camilla lose her title. No criticism of their marriage. The wording was reportedly much colder. And perhaps more powerful. The document focused on the institution. A new reign would begin with one sovereign and one principal working household. A surviving consort could remain part of public life. But their institutional structure would not continue automatically. Charles reportedly understood the implication immediately. If he died first, Camilla could lose the machinery around her. Not her family. Not necessarily her public respect. But the automatic institutional power that came with Charles's reign. Then came the question that reportedly changed the room. Charles asked about Clarence House. Would Camilla keep it? There was reportedly a pause. And that pause said almost everything. Because Clarence House was tied to the old model. The Queen Mother had stayed there for decades. Charles had grown up seeing that arrangement. But William's message was reportedly direct. Nothing from the previous reign would automatically control the next one. Not the house. Not the office. Not the staff. Not the communication structure. The next king would decide. Charles reportedly leaned back. And suddenly, the conversation became less about constitutional arrangements and more about a husband thinking about his wife's future. Charles has waited longer than any British heir in modern history to become king. He became monarch at 73. Then, only months into his reign, Buckingham Palace announced that he had cancer. So sitting in that room, he was being asked to imagine a future without himself. A future where William was king. And Camilla was no longer surrounded by the same royal machinery. That must have been difficult to hear. But then Catherine reportedly made it even more personal. She explained that the same principle would apply to her. If William died before her and George became king, she would not expect George to maintain a separate court for his mother. That statement changed the entire argument. Catherine was not asking William to take something away from Camilla. She was agreeing to give up the same privilege herself. And reportedly, she explained the reason in a powerful way. Her son should inherit the crown without also inheriting his mother's authority. That idea became the heart of the proposal. Family should not automatically become government. Love should not automatically become institutional power. And popularity should not create a second royal center. But Charles still had one more person he needed to hear from. Camilla. Later that evening, she was reportedly brought into the room. And, according to the account, she immediately sensed something was wrong. Charles was quiet. William looked tense. Catherine sat beside the open folder. Camilla reportedly asked what had happened. William explained the proposal. He did not begin by talking about her title. He talked about the future. One sovereign. One principal working household. Other members of the family could remain visible and active. But no former royal household would continue automatically into the next reign. Camilla reportedly understood the meaning quickly. She asked whether this applied to her. William's answer was reportedly careful. It affected her, but it was not written specifically for her. That distinction mattered, because the document was not saying Camilla would disappear. She could remain part of the family. She could continue supporting causes. She could attend royal events when invited. She could remain an important public figure, but there would be no automatic guarantee that the machinery surrounding Charles would continue around her. And that is a very different kind of loss. A title can be seen. A staff structure can be invisible. But losing institutional machinery can completely change how someone operates. Camilla reportedly asked the obvious question. If Charles is gone, does that mean she disappears? The answer was reportedly no. Losing automatic authority is not the same as disappearing. A former queen could remain important, but her role would depend on the new monarch. And William reportedly summarized the entire idea with one simple distinction. Family is not the same as government. That sentence explains almost everything. But then came the second page. Camilla reportedly believed she had reached the end of the proposal. She had not. William reportedly turned the page. 3 words appeared at the top. The one court principle. Underneath was a list. And Camilla's name was there. But it was not alone. Catherine's name was included. Future consorts were included. Even future situations involving George and Charlotte were reportedly covered. That changed everything. Because now the document could not easily be described as a personal attack. It was designed as a rule for future reigns. If a king dies, his working household ends. If a queen dies, her working household ends. If a future consort survives a monarch, their personal role may continue, but their institutional structure does not automatically move forward. The next sovereign decides. That was the principle. And suddenly Camilla had a much harder argument to make. Because the same rule could one day affect Catherine. It could affect George's future wife. It could affect George's future wife. It could affect Charlotte if she ever becomes monarch. It could even affect people who have not yet been born. That is what makes a rule different from a family dispute. A family argument ends with the people involved. A rule survives them. And William reportedly wanted exactly that. He did not want the monarchy to keep making decisions based on whichever arrangement happened to exist during the previous reign. He wanted the next sovereign to have the freedom to build his own household. There was another person whose opinion reportedly mattered. Princess Anne. William reportedly spoke privately with his aunt before the Windsor meeting, and has spent decades watching the royal institution change. She has seen monarchs come and go. She has watched traditions survive. And she has watched others disappear. William reportedly asked whether ending the Queen Mother-style model would weaken the monarchy. Her response was simple. Different reign.
Different family.
And when asked whether the next king should be allowed to establish his own structure, Anne reportedly supported the principle. Her reasoning was even simpler. The next king has to be allowed to be king. That does not mean disrespecting a former queen. It does not mean erasing history. It means separating personal loyalty from institutional authority. And that distinction is at the center of the entire story. A former queen can remain loved. She can remain respected. She can remain active. But automatic authority does not have to follow her into the next reign. Back inside Windsor, Charles reportedly read the second page again. At first, he had been looking at it as Camilla's husband. Now he was looking at it as king. And that changed the question. It was no longer, does Camilla deserve protection? The question became, should any former consort automatically carry an independent royal structure into the next reign? According to the account, William's answer was no. But there was another detail. A future sovereign could always choose to involve a former consort. George could invite Catherine to official events. William could invite Camilla. A future monarch could continue someone's charitable work. The difference is that the invitation would come from the new reign. It would not be inherited automatically from the old one. That gives the new king something previous generations did not always have.
Choice.
And perhaps that is the real power behind the proposed rule. Because tradition can become powerful simply because nobody challenges it. One arrangement happens. Then another generation copies it. Eventually, people stop asking why. They simply call it tradition. William and Catherine reportedly wanted to break that cycle. But there is an important historical comparison. In 2022, Queen Elizabeth II publicly expressed her wish that Camilla would become queen consort when Charles became king. That was a remarkable intervention. A reigning monarch was effectively helping shape the public understanding of the next reign. The proposed William-Catherine principle would move in the opposite direction. The previous reign would not automatically dictate how the next reign operates. That would be a major change in thinking. And it explains why the alleged document is so significant. Because it is not really about Camilla. It is about succession. It is about what happens after the applause stops, the funeral ends, and a new monarch sits on the throne. Who controls the offices? Who controls the staff? Who controls the diary? Who decides which royal family members continue official duties? Who controls the communications operation? And who decides whether a former consort remains institutionally active? Under this proposed model, the answer is simple. The new sovereign. That would give William control when his reign begins. And one day, it would give George the same freedom. But there is an uncomfortable irony here. Catherine reportedly helped create a rule that could eventually limit her own position. Imagine a future where William dies earlier than expected. George becomes king while still young. Catherine remains alive, popular, and deeply respected. The public might want her to stay at the center of royal life. But under the principle she reportedly supported, popularity would not automatically create a second court. She would have to let her son decide. That is a sacrifice. And it may be the reason the proposal appears harder to dismiss as revenge. Catherine was reportedly willing to give up the same privilege she was asking Camilla to give up. That makes the story much more complicated. Because the argument began with Camilla, but it ends with Catherine. And perhaps that is exactly why William could stand behind it. There is also another historical shadow hanging over this discussion. Princess Diana. After her divorce from Charles, Diana remained one of the most famous women in the world. But her formal royal position changed. She kept certain connections and charitable interests, but much of the official machinery surrounding her was gone. Then she died in 1997. William was only 15. He walked behind his mother's coffin through London while millions watched. That experience shaped him. He saw what happens when a family tragedy and an institution collide. And according to the logic behind the story, he does not want future royal children to face the same confusion. If George someday becomes king after losing William, he should not have to wonder whether his mother has a competing institutional role. The crown should be clear. The authority should be clear. And the family relationship should remain separate from the machinery of government. That is the deeper reason this proposed rule could matter. It is not about removing someone. It is about defining what survives a reign. Titles may survive. Memories survive. Family survives. Charities may survive. But institutional authority belongs to the monarch currently wearing the crown. And that is a much bigger idea than Camilla. If the reported document is genuine, it could affect every future generation of the monarchy. One day, George may face the same decision. One day, Charlotte might. One day, someone not yet born could become the surviving spouse of a British monarch. And they would face the same principle. The previous reign ends. The next one begins. No automatic second court. No inherited staff structure. No guaranteed institutional headquarters. The new monarch decides. And that brings us back to Charles. According to the account, he eventually closed the folder. He reportedly did not explode. He did not throw it across the room. He did not order William or Catherine out. Instead, he asked William to stay behind. Camilla and Catherine left. Father and son were alone. And Charles reportedly asked a different question. Not about Camilla, about Catherine. Had William really thought about what this rule could mean for his own wife? William reportedly answered yes. Because Catherine had already thought about it. She had chosen the rule knowing that someday it could apply to her. That may have been the hardest part for Charles to accept. His son was not simply protecting his future reign. He was also limiting his own family's future power. The argument that started with Camilla had become a principle about the crown itself. And perhaps that is why the story has so much weight. Because the monarchy has always depended on continuity. But continuity can become dangerous when it turns into automatic authority. The new reign needs continuity, but it also needs freedom. And William appears to be drawing a line between the two. Respect can continue. Family can continue. Public service can continue. But the old machinery does not automatically follow. That is the boundary. And if the reported document ever becomes public, that one principle could be remembered as one of the quietest but most important changes to the modern royal system. For now, however, there is one major problem. None of this has reportedly been formally announced. The alleged meeting, the folder, and the second page remain part of the story being circulated rather than an officially confirmed royal announcement. And that distinction matters. Because the British monarchy is built on documents, traditions, official statements, and carefully recorded decisions. Until something is publicly confirmed, it should be treated as an alleged development, not established fact. But if the reported principle is real, the implications are enormous. Camilla would not necessarily be pushed away. She would not suddenly stop being family. She would not automatically lose every public role. Instead, something quieter would happen. The machinery around her would no longer belong to her by default. The next king would decide, and Catherine would face the same rule one day. So perhaps the biggest twist is not what happens to Camilla. It is what William and Catherine are reportedly willing to give up themselves. Because the moment Catherine placed her own future under the same rule, the argument changed. It stopped looking like revenge. It started looking like succession planning. One crown, one sovereign, one working household. And after decades of following tradition, the monarchy may finally be asking a question it has avoided for generations. When a reign ends, should the power surrounding it end too? That question could shape everything that comes next. And if you want more stories about the hidden decisions, tensions, and future battles surrounding the royal family, stay with Crown Aura Updates. Because sometimes the biggest royal changes do not begin with a public announcement. Sometimes they begin with one quiet folder placed on a table. And sometimes the most important page is the one nobody was supposed to see.